Hello, everyone. My name is Troy Beverly, and I'd like to go over a very controversial subject, the N word. I'll give you a little background on myself. I have a BA in history and a BA in English. I am fluent in German and Spanish, and I've traveled quite a bit when I was in the military for 20 years. Excuse me. The origin of the N word. I have reason to believe that since the first Europeans to explore Africa and to colonize the Americas were Portuguese and then Spanish, that the N word derives from Spanish and Portuguese, which is negro, which means a black person. And the second people, if I remember correctly, or third people to explore were the Dutch, who spoke and still do a Germanic language. The and so I think they made the term their own. That's where the N word comes from, as we know it. Nigger. I don't want to say it. Because in Germanic languages, of course, the Nigg part comes from the Negro, because they probably asked the Spaniards and the Portuguese what they referred to us as. They said, we call them Negros, Okay, so that's where the term comes from for them, I think, the base of it. But the suffix ER, as you probably know, in Germanic languages, including English, means a person. So just like a reporter, somebody who reports, a driver, somebody who drives, ER. So that's where the Germanic pronunciation of the root term negro comes into play. Now, and when I was in Panama in the late 90s on my way to Germany, when I was in the Army, I was learning German, and the dictionary I used at the time had the term Nigger and as the term for a black person. And so when I got to Germany, I asked a German friend of mine, after a few months of living there, I said, why don't you all call us the N word anymore? And he said, we don't, do you want to be called that? I remember. And I said, well, and I'll tell you why it wouldn't have offended me when I talk about a Dutch former colony. And so now they refer to black people as Schwarzerman, or Schwarzermaner, which would be plural. But Schwarzerman means, Schwarz means black, man means man. So black man is Schwarzerman. And so they don't use the N word anymore. But I remember in the 80s listening to a German song, and they kept saying the N word. So when referring to black people. So as of the 80s, it was in common use, I would assume. And so likewise, English, that's where the N word comes from for English. So the bottom line is, I don't think it has a bad source. I think it just means black person in all of the European languages originally. As I said, I have a bachelor's in English, so I've actually read most of the of classic literature, most of the must reads, at least, for sure. And I read uh, Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, who was not a racist, by the way. He helped out the first black person to attend Yale financially, and so if he was not, he was anti-racist actually, but obviously his book has has been criticized of late because of his using the N word. Huckleberry Finn used it, and even one of his characters used it, a black character, when referring to himself. So there is a debate, controversy. There is controversy about whether the term should be taken out of his books. But eventually, I think most, well, having been in many college classes, I know that the school of thought that prevailed was to just leave it as it was. And so, but uh, it's still debated if it should be left. I think it should be left that way. But I also think that having read the book and having seen how the black character, the boy in the book, referred to himself as the N word, that in the just 2 decades after slavery, that it wasn't pejorative. It doesn't seem to have been, at least in my opinion, judging by the way that it was commonly used. Even though black people were looked down upon just after slavery, and of course, even more so during slavery. So, but then you go into the early 20th century. That's at around the turn of the century. I would imagine that's when the N word became pejorative and not just the way of referring to a black person in general. Not that they weren't called Negroes as well, because you can see from even the 1500s, 1600s in the United States that we were referred to as Negroes for sale, etc. So there were different ways of referring to us. And then you might ask, where does the term Negro come from? That's not it doesn't have a Germanic source. So the same place that Negro comes from, which people don't have a problem with, even though we don't use it anymore, is, in my opinion, the same place that the N word comes from. But Sinclair Lewis, who was obviously a racist, in his book Babbitt that I read, when he referred to black people with using the N word, it was definitely pejorative. The N word in Latin America, and I lived in Panama for 5 years. As I said, I speak Spanish. I used to look at the telenovelas with my wife to learn Spanish, improve my Spanish. I still do. And in the 90s, Colombians referred to black people as negros. I don't know if they still do. However, Panamanians didn't use the term negros, even though most of Latin America, as far as I know, did. Panamanians used the term morenos, which means brunette in Spanish, Castilian Spanish. And likewise, nowadays, Mexicans don't use the term negro to refer to a black person. They bleep it out in the novellas nowadays when you come across negro, and you can tell that they're using the term negro by their lips, and also by when they're referring to a black person. So nowadays in Mexico, to say negro is similar to saying the N word in the United States. So how did that come to be? And we'll get into that, into the difference between connotative and denotative meanings. And so, like, When I went to Suriname, which was a Dutch colony originally, it was called Dutch Guyana. It's one of the three Guyanas: Guyana, which was English, Dutch Guyana, and now you have French Guyana. But now it's not. One of them changed its name, and it's called Suriname, which means sun in the Native American language. I don't know which one, Carib or Arawak, I think it is. There were two, and I met people of both of those ethnicities, by the way. When I was there in the mid 1990s, the blacks referred to themselves as the N-word, Nigger, and they had no problem with it. And so again, it goes back to the Germanic languages, including English. Originally, it just means a black person. The term black in the United States is being used, it seems to me, less and less. And people are opting for the term African American nowadays more and more. When I was in a Spanish class, I was sitting in a group, because we worked in groups. In case you haven't taken foreign language classes, students work in groups often. And I was in a group of three with two, all of us happened to be African American or black. And my two classmates, that we were speaking in Spanish, and we had to describe ourselves, and I referred to myself, as being negro. And they took offense, even though I could have called myself black in English, but I couldn't call myself negro in Spanish. And they asked, we were sitting next to the professor, and they said, "How do you say African American in Spanish?" And she told them, and so when they had their parts, they referred to themselves as African Americans, Afroamericanos in Spanish. So even nowadays, I see that black seems to be becoming at least less comfortable than African American. So I hope you understand where I'm going with all this. Now, the difference the denotative meaning of a term is the pure meaning of the term. Basically, the source of it, what's called the etymology, where it comes from, whether Greek or whatever language, or from the source of the same language. But basically, no emotion involved, just purely what does that term mean. I think I've demonstrated that negro in Spanish means black person, and the N-word in Germanic languages originally meant black person. I think it's safe to say. So that's the denotative meaning. Then you have the connotative meaning, which can change over time, and that involves emotions. So if a person, judging by their tone of voice, if this white person says it with this tone of voice and a negative, and then another one says in a negative and another one, then after a while, it grates on your nerves and you want to be called something else. And so that's a connotative meaning. So I just want you to know the difference between the two. So I'm going over the denotative meaning of and the origin of the N-word. Now, I'm not saying that black people should, in all venues and general conversation among other races, call themselves the N-word. I'm not saying that at all, because it's become a pejorative term, so why use it? Common sense tells you if something has a negative meaning, it's probably not good to use it. But by the same token, if I'm called that by a person of another race, then I take it upon myself to call them a pejorative term that describes their race. And that's to be on the offensive instead of the defensive. And that's what I recommend to all people. But everybody has their own opinion, and that is mine. That's all it is. And when it comes to using black people using the N-word, like in rap songs when I was coming up, I was about 16 when they started. Rap was listened to, as you probably know, mainly by black people originally, and we used the term all the time. People from the inner city use the term, the N-word, and we still do. Some of us of a certain age still do when we're around ourselves. But rap music became mainstream, and then now all of a sudden, now you have people of other races using the N-word in the black pronunciation, not in the ER pronunciation, the AH pronunciation, to refer to black people. And I don't approve of that. And this is controversial. I think that black people, when we're in our comfort zones, that we should, this is what if somebody that is black and they're comfortable with it, because I come from the inner city, so I'm comfortable in my skin using the term around my own people. But I don't think that is something that should be used around other races.